You are now listening to the Unscripted Ohio Podcast, brought to you by Buckeye Grove. For all the latest Buckeyes news, analysis, reaction, and the best Ohio State community on the entire internet, head over to BuckeyeGrove.com or follow us on Twitter at Ohio State Rivals. Without any further delay, it's time to get unscripted, broadcasting from Podcast Central, a place that is not his mother's basement.
Hey, Mom! We get some meatloaf!
We promise. Here's your host, Kyle Lamb.
Hey, Mom! The meatloaf!
Good Monday, everybody. Welcome back to the Unscripted Ohio Podcast. We are presented by BuckeyeGrove.com, and I am your host, Kyle Lamb. Normally, this would be our Monday wrap-up show in season. We've been doing these recaps, the assessments of what happened with Ohio State over the weekend with Kirk Barton and Ross Bolton and I. But as you know, Ohio State was on a bye week this past weekend, or an open date, as the AP's Ralph Russo would like to remind people. It is not a bye week, it is an open date. So I will call it that because I know that is a big pet peeve of his. But anyhow, no matter how you spin it, because Ohio State did not play this weekend, there's not really a lot of football to talk about this week for Ohio State. But we do have Mark Gibler coming up here in a few minutes, and we'll get into some recruiting, which is long overdue, despite the fact that it's kind of been dry season for Ohio State football recruiting. But there are a few topics that I would like to discuss, including Noah Cain. Of course, Zach Harrison is always on the forefront of everybody's conversations when it comes to Ohio State football recruiting right now. We'll talk about Wan'Dale Robinson. We'll get into that in a few minutes with Mark. Looking forward to it. And we will talk some Ohio State football as we preview the Buckeyes and Cornhuskers. And I'm laughing because I'm thinking about this crazy blackout that the Ohio State promotions team is running for the noon kickoff against 2-6 Nebraska on Saturday. And this was clearly a case, and I get this. They had this game circled coming into the year that they were going to run this promotion. And, they were thinking blackout, let's, black out the shoe for Ohio State, Nebraska. They were expecting an evening game. And then, of course, Ohio State loses on top of Nebraska starting out 0-6. And naturally, the television networks are not picking this up as an evening game now because there's just not a point to it. Ohio State's not undefeated, and Nebraska is 2-6. So it wound up being put on television at noon. But the Ohio State promotions team did not have a backup plan because the home schedule outside of Michigan at the end of the regular season wound up being really weak this year. So here's what we are left with. We are left with a blackout for a noon kickoff against a 2-6 team. It feels awkward, strange. It's going to be the most anticlimactic blackout ever. I don't see it being successful. I think we're going to see a lot of white, a lot of scarlet, a lot of gray in the crowd. I frankly think it's going to be the suckiest blackout we have ever seen. But nonetheless, Ohio State, Nebraska coming up this weekend, and Sean Callahan, publisher and editor of Husker Online, they are the Nebraska site dedicated to Nebraska football on the Rivals Network. He will join me as we preview the Cornhuskers. Nebraska winning 2 games in a row after dropping 6. And look, despite the fact that they started 0-6, this is I'm going to stop short of using the word dangerous. I almost said dangerous Nebraska team, but they are a capable Nebraska team and better than their record. They have been a disaster this season, but they do have a very mobile, athletic quarterback who can make a lot of plays in Adrian Martinez. And just given Ohio State's problems that it's had with inconsistency on defense, and we saw what Trace McSorley did as a mobile quarterback, I think Nebraska is capable of giving Ohio State some concerns here on Saturday. So it's far from a foregone conclusion that the Buckeyes will win, but we will preview that game coming up. So, as I mentioned, Mark Gibler will be along here in just a minute, and we'll get into recruiting. But one topic I did want to talk about, because I thought, this got some run on Twitter, and I discussed it myself on my Twitter account at KYLAM8. Of course, as you would expect, and I think everybody anticipated that Purdue would wind up losing to Michigan State this weekend, and they gave Michigan State a good game. And to be honest, Michigan State's defense is playing really, really well now. I think Michigan State's defense has kind of turned the corner and slowly, quietly becoming one of the better defenses in the country. My stance. I think Michigan is the best defense in the country right now. I think they're slightly ahead of Alabama, but I think Michigan State's not on that level, but they are defending really well. I think they're becoming a top 10 type of defense. Unfortunately for Michigan State, their offense is poo. It stinks right now. There's not much sugarcoating that. But by the way, I'm very concerned about Ohio State going up to East Lansing in that Michigan State game. That has all the trappings and the earmarks of a really, really tough test. So anyway, Purdue losing to Michigan State over the weekend, in itself, not really that big of a deal. It doesn't look bad. It doesn't reflect poorly on Purdue. But I think everybody expected it just because it's like, how many times have we seen a team give Ohio State a game? It's their Super Bowl, and then they come back down, crashing down to earth the next week. Maybe they lost to Ohio State by a field goal. Maybe they lost by 7 points. We saw it with Indiana. We saw it with Minnesota. So many times the past several seasons we've seen a team give Ohio State all they can muster, and then the following week they lose to whatever opponent, fill in the blank, right? Losing to Michigan State is not a big deal, and I don't think any less of Purdue, but it just goes to show that Ohio State is the Super Bowl for every single team they play. Alabama fits that category also. I think Ohio State and Alabama are the two preeminent programs that fit that. But I posted on Saturday after Purdue had lost. I did this research myself. I looked at the last 5 seasons, and all teams that had played Ohio State had played an FBS opponent before Ohio State and played an FBS opponent after Ohio State. Before playing Ohio State, these teams had a combined aggregate record over the past 5 seasons of 32-13. And I looked this up just to make sure that we're showing that these teams Ohio State are playing, they're not garbage. I just looked immediately before the Ohio State game and then looked at the game after. And I did this kind of for an apples-to-apples comparison to show what the teams did coming into the game and then what they did coming out of the game. And, of course, I excluded games that were played against FCS opponents, and I excluded when if a team played an FCS opponent either before or after. I also excluded that sample from the data so that we're only including teams that played FBS before and FBS after. So these teams, 32-13 in aggregate in 5 seasons against Ohio State, right before playing Ohio State. Their record afterwards, and this has become such a topic of conversation because, like I said, we know the perception was teams lose after playing Ohio State, and the record shows that the stats, the data bears this out. These teams are 14-31 in the past 5 seasons after playing Ohio State. So there are theories abound about this, and I think the most likely explanation, and there might be some fluke within the sample. I think there's some randomness to it. 45 games is not a overwhelming sample. I think it's big enough to draw some type of conclusions with, but there's more going on here than just the getting up for Ohio State and then being ruined and being drained, emotionally drained the following week. But still, I think this says something. Now, most people assumed that if we ran these numbers, we would find the same for Alabama. And I myself thought that as well. I actually, after getting a lot of suggestions that I should crunch the numbers for Alabama, I was expecting to see the very same trend because Alabama is the Super Bowl of people down south right now. I mean, what Alabama has done, they are on a level of their own. Ohio State and Clemson are the only 2 teams that have been able to somewhat stay on their level for bits and pieces of time, but Alabama is on a different level and in a different stratosphere right now. So they are the Super Bowl. They are the template, the threshold. They are the peak of the mountain on the mountaintop. And I expected to see very similar numbers, but what I was surprised to learn is that was not the case. So in a 5-year period, So before playing Alabama, opponents of Alabama against the FBS competition, opponents are 21-11, which is very similar to the 32-13. 32-13 is obviously about almost a 75% winning percentage. 21-11 is about a 67% winning percentage. So they're comparable. But afterwards, these same opponents are 19-13 in their games against FBS opponents following an Alabama loss. Okay, or in a couple cases wins. Ole Miss beat Alabama a few times. Texas A&M beat them once or twice. But usually when you play Alabama, you're losing. But regardless, when these teams play the following week, win or lose against Alabama, they're 19-13 in the following games, which is very, very different than 14-31. And you may be asking, well, why is there a big discrepancy in the number of games played in the same number of time? And that is because, like I said, I'm only using games that were played against FBS opponents both before and after the game in question. So because the SEC has so many, FCS opponents, that takes a lot of those games out of the sample, and that's why you see the difference in numbers. But regardless, so when you look at this, it's very, very interesting then. It begs the question, why are teams struggling so much after playing Ohio State and not struggling against Alabama? Because I honestly think there is something to the whole Super Bowl angle. I think when you have a lot of games, you have these premier night games, especially against Ohio State, because Ohio State, remember, is the preeminent program in America when it comes to television ratings. So Ohio State is drawing night games and late afternoon games a lot more than Alabama is. Alabama plays in that cushy 3:30 SEC slot on CBS quite often. Sometimes they're playing at noon, but they're not playing the primetime evening games very often. They'll play sometimes once or twice in a year, but mostly they're confined to that 3:30 time slot. Ohio State, though, they're playing almost exclusively 3:30 and 7:30, 8 o'clock kickoffs. You see the night game against Purdue, despite the fact Purdue was 3-3 at the time, it was still a home game, a premier night game that got put in the evening, and that's because Ohio State draws. There is no other program, including Alabama, that draws the type of television ratings that the Buckeyes draw. So I think that there is some expectation that Ohio State draws more hype from opponents. Mark Gibler and I have talked about this in the past, and some other people as well. It's like, Kirk has mentioned it. Recruits and their families, and then eventually players, when they commit and become an opponent of Ohio State, they're looking and circling this Ohio State game because it's like, NFL scouts are watching these games. They're watching Ohio State. They're watching how you do against Ohio State. And I'm not saying that doesn't exist with Alabama, because obviously it definitely does. But I think when you combine that with all of the night games and all the hype going into the Ohio State games because of the television draw, as well as the Big Ten standings, and Ohio State always in competition for the playoff now, and especially, since the playoff started in 2014, I think that in itself is a contributing factor for why teams are doing so poorly the next week. I just think it takes a lot out of you, emotionally as well as physically. It's hard after getting up for such a game like that to come back and have the same emotion. You tend to have a letdown game the following week. And there is some truth to that, because this is something Vegas takes into account. They handicap games. They're handicapping the line, the point spread, based on this factor. It may only, drag it down a point or two, but it is something they look at. And that's why, if you look at a lot of these, Vegas type of websites that handicap games and have numbers against the spread and that sort of thing, you're also seeing, how teams are faring when they, beat the spread or miss the spread one week, how they do the next week, how they're bouncing back. And that's because there is the emotional factor within these games and results. So it's just interesting numbers. Of course, this has been happening now for five years, and actually I looked back in 13 and 12, and it was happening there as well. I just didn't include those in the numbers. But teams are 14-31 coming off an Ohio State game, really interesting. I think there's probably more to it. Like I said, there's some randomness, there's some luck in there, probably some other things. But the fact is that you can't ignore that record. And I'm just surprised it didn't go for Alabama because I thought that would be very similar. But can't explain it. I just thought it was interesting. I'm not trying to read too much into this. And I'm not also, by the way, let me point out that the point in bringing these numbers up and discussing them isn't to excuse and rationalize necessarily what's happening with Ohio State's performances. Because unlike Alabama, Ohio State has tripped up in some games that they probably shouldn't. And I'm not necessarily worried about the wins or losses necessarily. You know, losing to Purdue at night on the road is forgivable. Losing at Iowa on the road is forgivable. It's more about how poorly they played in those games than actually losing them. Where I credit Alabama is, Alabama has only had 2 undefeated seasons in the past 10 years. So it's not like Alabama runs the table every year, because they really don't. Like I said, only 2 out of the past 10 seasons have they gone undefeated. So Alabama does lose in the regular season. So Ohio State and Alabama are very similar in that regard. The only difference being that, Alabama's losses have come, since 2007, all of Alabama's losses have come to ranked teams. And the other difference being is they just don't lay the egg the way Ohio State lost 49-20 to Purdue, or the way they lost 55-28 to Iowa. That is something that Alabama has been very consistent about. When they lose, it's generally been right down to the wire. It's close games. They're just beaten by a little bit. And I think, so I'm not trying to excuse the losses and say, well, just because they're, Ohio State is the Super Bowl for all these opponents, that should excuse it necessarily. That doesn't excuse losing 49-20, in my opinion. But it does make some sense of why they're getting some of these tough shots from opponents. But you would expect Alabama, you would certainly think that Alabama is getting that as well, and they are. The only difference, for whatever reason, is Alabama is not inflicting damage on these teams when they move forward. So I don't know how to explain those numbers. I don't know how to make sense of that and the differential, but something is going on there, and I would love to know what the reason was for it. But anyhow, I thought it was some interesting information, interesting conversation. Like I said, Ohio State coming up this weekend, Saturday at noon against Nebraska. We will preview that with Sean Callahan. But let's get into some football now, some recruiting talk with Mark Gibler.
It's time to go inside Ohio State recruiting and take a peek behind the scenes with Buckeye Grove recruiting guru Mark Gibler and his magical orb of wonderment. They said it couldn't be done, but he's outdone himself once more. Back for another recruiting roundup.
That's what I do. I drink and I know things.
All right, we are going to dive into some recruiting now. It's been a couple weeks. Mark, how you been, my man?
Good. Been kind of busy. A lot of traveling here, checking guys off the list before the regular season ended. Glad to be back on here with you, and it's starting to get interesting. We're getting to the point of big boy recruiting is starting soon.
It has been more of an eerily quiet recruiting season than normal. Some of it because of all the stuff that happened back in August, and then smaller class, smaller number of guys that they're targeting right now. But it has been I know that the major recruiting usually doesn't happen until November, December, but it is really quiet even for this time of year, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it's been a weird cycle in general. Just a lot of weird things, kind of causing a snowball effect, I guess. At the beginning, they were being very, very tight with their offers and with who they were ready to take and who they were really pushing for, and because they don't have a lot of seniors on this team, and the numbers aren't going to be. I mean, I know what I say all the time. Don't worry about the numbers, but this isn't going to be one of those gigantic 27 guy classes. They're gonna have to stretch things to get into the low 20s. But so you have that, and it's not a great class nationally, which we've harped on before. So, you're having trouble at certain positions. Really, do I, do we love this guy, or do we just kind of like him? And then the Zach Smith Urban Meyer thing made it virtually impossible to recruit for about 2 months. So it has, and then you come out of that, and again, because you didn't cast a very wide net, there's not a lot of guys left. So here we are. I don't know. It's been very, very odd. One, it definitely, I would say probably the strangest recruiting cycle that I've covered under Urban Meyer at Ohio State.
3 weeks ago, Ohio State was looking really, really good for Wan'Dale Robinson. He visits, and it just goes quiet. People assume that eventually Ohio State was going to win out over Kentucky, and then next thing you know, here comes Nebraska, and now there's a lot of genuine concern that the Cornhuskers may pull off an upset in this situation. What happened there? How did that happen so abruptly?
Yeah, I don't know if we all just collectively overlooked Nebraska. I mean, and I have to, Dave Lackford from our Kentucky Prep site posted this on the board a month or two ago, or within the last month and a half maybe, that Nebraska was there. So I mean, this has turned out to be a fantastic call that he made, but Wan'Dale had that visit there the first weekend of the season, and loved the visit. And then then Nebraska went out and lost their first 6 games, and he visited Alabama and Ohio State, and there wasn't a whole lot of juice there with Nebraska. It didn't seem like, but it's possible that he has just done a really, really good job of kind of keeping that under wraps for the past 2 months. So here we are now, and I think it's going to be Nebraska or Ohio State. It's weird because the on the Ohio State side of things, kind of the people I've talked to, their concern has kind of ping-ponged back and forth between Alabama and Kentucky. Nebraska was not the major concern up until very recently. So I don't know if Wan'Dale just kept this under wraps, and the Nebraska losing the momentum with that kind of dreadful start they had has kind of been overplayed, but it definitely looks like it's Nebraska or Ohio State right now, and it's tight. From what I'm told, it's still kind of up in the air. I don't know that I have a firm. Like I said the other day, my Ohio State pick feels shaky, but I don't know that I've got a firm pick yet, as we are like 4 days out.
Yeah, we've talked so much in the past about how sometimes it doesn't help to be the perceived leader or leaders, because those are the schools that other schools are beating up on in recruiting and, trying to attack every negative angle they can. And in a situation like this, maybe Nebraska was there all along, maybe they weren't, but, maybe this is a case where despite Nebraska's 0-6 start, Ohio State, Alabama got beat up on, and it just allowed Nebraska to kind of stay in the race, which is impressive. Whether they came in out of the blue or whether they were there all along, with that 0-6 start, for them to be in the position they're in right now is impressive, I think, either way.
Yeah, I mean, they can definitely sell. I mean, gosh, Tyjon Lindsey transferred. I mean, they can sell early playing time perhaps better than anybody. I mean, I know Ohio State's selling it because of Paris Campbell being a senior, and KJ Hill, I think we can assume is likely leaving after the season to go to the NFL. But Nebraska can really kind of sell like almost like a kind of a Rondale Moore situation where, hey, you can come in and do what Rondale Moore is doing at Purdue, because they don't really have a guy like him right now, and I think that's been appealing to him. But at the same time, he's been very impressed with just the overall the prestige of the Alabamas and the Ohio States. Now, the one thing with Alabama is I don't feel, in talking to Wan'Dale and even talking to people on the Alabama side of things, that Alabama has been very consistent with him. I think they've probably been the least consistent with him the last couple months, and I think that's why they are right now pretty much on the outside looking in. So that helped Ohio State for sure, as Ohio State was kind of climbing the ladder here the last 2 months themselves. But when I talked to him last week after his game, and I mentioned this on the board, I don't like to put a lot of stock into the quotes I get a lot of times. A lot of times there's different reasons kids say different things, and you can't just take everything at face value. But it was very telling to me when I asked him about his decision, and he said, "I'm just going to get away from everybody. I want to just," basically said he wants to get away from people who are pressuring him. And the only pressure I could think of would be local pressure to go to Kentucky, which is not far down the road. And so that to me was the first sign of like, okay, well, it's not Kentucky. And so that's great for Ohio State, right? And then, the more you dig into that, you start to hear the Nebraska stuff, and it's like, oh, here we go. So I think it's going to be one of those two, and the Nebraska stuff is definitely something that I would be concerned about if I were Ohio State right now.
And, Ohio State is definitely in the market for another back. And now, after a lot of speculation that Noah Cain would visit Ohio State for the Michigan game on November 24th, he did finally set that visit. So where do the Buckeyes stand now as they wait for that visit in a month from now?
Yeah, I mean, he keeps telling me that his relationship with them has never been better. I think there's a little bit of not gamesmanship, but I would maybe say that's maybe a bit of a hyperbole. But it's definitely better. Things are definitely better there than they were a few months ago, where it wasn't looking great. I mean, there was maybe a chance they weren't going to get a visit, because he kind of cut it to 6, so obviously one's going to be out. And there was a chance there for a while that Ohio State was going to be the one that was going to be out, but that obviously has not happened. He is visiting for the Michigan game, which he's been pretty consistent about that with me for a while. But I guess it's officially official, whatever that means. It's not really officially official until he lands in Columbus that Friday, but it's on target. LSU and Texas having pretty good seasons themselves, I don't think helps Ohio State. I think those two are probably the two to really beat right now. But 2 months ago, Ohio State was probably 6 out of 6 teams that are left. I would say they're at least third today. That's a lot better. So it's moving in the right direction. I've compared this to Dwayne Haskins, I think, on the podcast before, where it looked great at the beginning and then it went dead for a while, and now it could just magically come back together for him. But it's going to be a big thing. I'm actually, not to continue to drag this statement out, but I'm actually very interested to see how this upcoming weekend against Nebraska goes, with 2 other running backs making official visits, and what that could mean for Noah if one of those two tries to jump on the commitment train here.
Yeah, so let's stick with that. What do we have coming up here for the Nebraska weekend? The big blackout noon game.
Glass and Marcus Crowley are both scheduled to make official visits this weekend, and we can talk about Trey Sanders if we want to get hits and clicks and things like that. But if we're not interested in the clickbait, we can cross Trey Sanders. I mean, that's such a pipe dream at this point. So it really is down to, I would say it's not, things can change. They can enter the mix for a new kid or something like that. But right now, the 3 really are Cain, Glass, and Crowley, and Marcus Crowley and DeAndre Glass will be on campus this weekend. So that's going to be super interesting. Glass is maybe a little more complicated because he is weighing several different schools. He's looking. I mean, he's got an Alabama visit set for later. I think it's the Auburn weekend, but it's later down the pike. He's got a few other visits he's looking to make. A lot of schools kind of still in the mix there. So this is a real chance for Ohio State to set the bar, I guess. They've been talking for a while. That's kind of one of the few, very, very few guys that Ohio State's actually been talking to, even a little bit before the Samson James decommitment. So for him, I mean, this is a big one. They're going to have to really crush it, though, because he's, like I said, it's looking like he could go visit a few other schools after this upcoming Ohio State visit. So it becomes a thing of, even if you just absolutely nail the visit, you've got to hang on for dear life, the next 6 weeks or whatever. With Marcus Crowley, that one's a lot more interesting to me because it wasn't a certainty they were going to get the visit. So they had to fight to get the visit, and then it was a matter of, okay, if he visits, because Miami, he's been very solid with Miami. If he visits, it's on, and he's visiting. And I know the Wades, Sean and family are doing a lot of work there. It feels, let's put it this way, there's some optimism that things are turning the right direction there. So that's going to be the interesting one for me, I think, this weekend. I think that maybe is the more immediate, in terms of maybe a decision. If you put a gun to my head, one of the two is going to pop this coming weekend. Which one would it be? I would think it'd be Marcus and not DeAndre. But gonna get very interesting here.
Yeah, and that's an interesting dynamic, too, because I want to see how Ohio State approaches this. I mean, they had two running backs and they were still chasing after Noah Cain. So even if they get one of those two, I don't think that changes Ohio State's – I'm putting words in your mouth, but I wouldn't think that changes Ohio State's approach. They're not going to back off Noah Cain even if they get a commitment. I guess in that case it would be a question of if they did get a commitment from one of these two, does Noah Cain still continue to pursue his Ohio State interest as he has so far?
Yeah, no, I think I agree. I agree with everything you just said there. They're going to keep recruiting Cain, but it's a matter of, okay, things started to get really good, and I would say they got good. They started to move in a better direction before James decommitted. Now, I'm sure James decommitting helped, but I know, talking to him in August versus talking to him in June, it was a totally different game. I mean, it just felt better for Ohio State. In August than it had, previously in June, or May or whatever, late spring, early summer. Just felt like things moved in the right direction over the summer. So, but if you go and you take a running back, in the next week or two, you're kind of right back to where you were before with the Samson James situation. Where now, okay, you've already got a couple now. Does Noah want to do that? So there's some interesting dynamics at play. What I will say is, I don't think Ohio State is in any position to turn down Glass or Crowley because Cain is not this slam dunk where if they just don't take another running back, they're going to get Noah Cain. No, I mean, he could still go to LSU. He could still go to Texas. Something could happen there where if you hold off one of these other two, you could end up with nothing. And to me, that would be a bad spot to be in because I do think they really need another running back in this class. It's going to be interesting how that plays out if they can get one, if that does impact Cain. I mean, it would be to get one of the two that are coming in the Nebraska weekend and to get Noah Cain would be probably a dream scenario. It'll be it's all like everything's kind of tied together. Everything it's moving parts.
So, speaking of this weekend, you spoke to Zach Harrison, who, informed you he is hoping to make it over to the game this weekend. So I want to start by asking, the typical, the obligatory Zach Harrison question. Where do you see this, and what kind of vibe did you get from him? As much as you can read anything into whatever Harrison says, what kind of vibe did you get in talking to him this week?
Yeah, he's so good at just not saying anything. I think there has to be real concern right now if you're Ohio State. I've been thinking about how to present this for most of the afternoon, and it's the best way I can explain it right now is that every school involved, so the three schools involved for him, Ohio State, Penn State, Michigan, some of them appeal to him on certain areas more than the other two schools, and then some of them have a negative or two attached to them. And that's why this has been so back and forth for 2 years now. And it's why it's been really hard for one team to hold momentum, because every time a team starts to feel good, the other two can kind of hammer at whatever the negative might be that Zach associates with each of those three schools. And the best way I can put it right now, and why I think Ohio State should probably be more concerned now than at any point previously, is that Michigan has been able to rectify the negatives. So a question Zach would have about Michigan would be, is that a program where I can go and compete for national championships, or is this the third or fourth best program in the Big Ten East? And that was a legitimate question 2 months ago. I don't think it's a legitimate question anymore. I think Michigan's going to be, when the playoff rankings come out, unless Michigan loses on Saturday, Michigan's going to be the highest ranked Big Ten team when the playoff rankings come out. So actually, no, those come out Tuesday though, don't they?
Yeah,
those come out this week.
Yeah, those come out this week. It'll be
so they're going to be the highest. So let's backtrack. Let's not even worry about it. They are going to be the highest. I don't think there's any way they're not.
Yeah.
They beat Michigan State, so they have answered questions there that I think existed going into the season of, is this staff going to get it done there, or are they going to be 8-4 this year and just be the third or fourth best team in the Big Ten East? And do I want to play, at a pro, or do I want to go somewhere where, a national championship might be more realistic? So they've been able to erase a negative there. The problem for Ohio State is that I don't know, they can't erase their negatives, because Ohio State's negatives are completely different. Ohio State's negatives are campus size and the idea that maybe he might not want to go 15 minutes down the road to play his college football. Well, you can't change that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was going to add, my next follow-up question was going to be, is there anything Ohio State could have done to erase whatever his issues are? But you basically...
I don't think so.
Yeah, so...
I think so. Not to throw a coach under the bus here, but I thought Ohio State, looking back in hindsight on Jackson Carman last year, because everyone's trying to tie these two together, looking back at Ohio State last year on Jackson Carman, I think it is fair to say that despite being hundreds of miles further away, and in USC's case, a couple of thousand miles further away, that Clemson and USC's coaches, assistant coaches, built a better relationship with Jack than Greg Stajuara did. I think that is a fair statement, and I think that's a concerning statement. When I look at Zach, I don't know what you do to make your campus feel smaller, or you certainly can't change the location of it. So, what are you supposed to do? I mean, in my opinion, they've played this about as well as they can, and if they don't get him, it just wasn't going to happen, I guess, because I don't think they've blown this one. And ironically, I think, with Michigan kind of did blow this one at the beginning. I'm not betraying Zach's trust here. He's told me this in interviews. He did not like his first 2 visits up there and was not going to go back. And then they hired Al Washington, and Al Washington, begged him to come back and just give him a chance. And it's been different ever since. And ever since that point, Michigan has slowly been able to build some momentum. So they've been able to erase 2 negatives. They've been able to erase the on-field questions about their performance with a really good run here the last month and a half. And they've also been able to repair relationships where they were losing the relationships battle. So, when you can repair your negatives, and the other school can't, it becomes very interesting to me. I mean, this is going to be a nail biter, I think. I know a lot of people are jumping off that, it's done, it's Michigan, and to be quite honest, he could very well be leaning that way today. I don't think it's done, though. I don't think he's put that level of thought into it. I think he's genuinely focused on his season and is just kind of going out to some games here and there and having some fun. And I think once his season is over, which could be this weekend, could be next weekend, I think he'll really sit down and go into decision-making mode. But yeah, I mean, I don't know how at this point, if you're Ohio State, I don't know what you can change.
Yeah, I had somebody tell me, and I mean, it sounds like you agree with this, but I'll kind of phrase this and let you answer for yourself. But I had somebody tell me that has some ties up there that just said, look, any speculation on Harrison is kind of worthless right now. It's like, it's like you said. I mean, there are some things that he likes and dislikes about all three schools, but he really has not come anywhere near deciding like this school leads or this is where I want to be. It seems like any thought that maybe he's leaning this way or that way, that seems to be extremely premature right now. Would you say that's accurate?
I mean, I think subconsciously these kids are always leaning some way.
Yeah.
But I don't think he has yet sat down with his parents and really made the hard decision yet, as far as anything like that goes. I don't think those types of conversations are going to be had until the season's over. He has been so animate with me since like July. I mean, just the last 4 months, he's like, look, once he decided to delay, he's like, I'm not worrying about this right now. He was looking so forward to his senior season. He got off to a tough start with the injury and missed a few games, but he's back. He's got his team in the playoffs now. He's like, that's really all I want to worry about right now. I'm going to go to a game at each place, and then once the season is over, there's going to be a window between whenever his season ends, which I would venture to guess will be in the next 2 to 3 weeks the most. I don't see them as a Final Four type team. Could be this weekend, could be next weekend, probably would be my guess. Whenever that point happens, between that time and December 19th, which is when the early signing period opens, those are when these tough conversations and the real hard decisions are going to be made. But subconsciously, I mean, sure, I'm sure they're, like I said, Michigan seems like they're, Penn State had early momentum, then they lost momentum, and Ohio State had it, then Michigan has picked it up. So this has went all over the place the last 12 months, and I think the real tough conversations won't happen until he's played his last snap of high school football.
Mark, before we wrap up, there was one other thing I wanted to ask you about because I thought this was interesting. Of course, Georgia lost another commitment this past week. Avery, the 5-star running back, and they have just been they've been bleeding. That great recruiting class that looked so amazing this summer has really taken some hits now, and I just wanted to get your thoughts on that because it has some. Obviously has some impact on what Ohio State may do with another one of their guys, and we'll get into that here in a second. But I'm curious what you make of them losing so many commitments now.
Yeah, and I don't want to go off tangent here too much, or go on my own tangent here, but I wanted to. There was something we that actually is related to this that I wanted to quickly hit on. So John Emery is the latest decommitment you're talking about, the running back, and he could very well end up at LSU, which could help Ohio State with Noah Cain. So that's all I want. I just want to put that. I kind of missed that while we were talking about the running backs. So just put that out there real quick. That's something to watch now, where that kid ends up. That could help Ohio State if he ends up at LSU. To your point. One thing I will say, and I say this when this happens to Ohio State. This happened to Ohio State last year, and I said to wait for it, and people still kind of got upset when it started to happen. It's going to happen to Georgia now too. When you land all these guys that early, it's not over. I don't know that I can be any more blunt than to say that commitments don't mean a whole lot. I mean, they just don't.
Yeah, they really don't.
And when you recruit, especially in the Southeast, where it's so competitive, when you get these guys early, that doesn't. Nick Saban and Ed Orgeron and all these and Dan Mullen, they're not looking and say, Nolan Smith committed. I guess we're going to stop recruiting him for even though he doesn't have to sign anywhere for 18 months. I guess we're just going to stop recruiting. That doesn't happen. And in fact, I think you even mentioned this just a few minutes ago on another topic. What it does is it puts the target on your back because now everyone else that's trying to get that kid knows who they got to, talk down about. So all it does is put the target. So when you're recruiting those types of kids, when you're recruiting the 5-star kids from the Southeast, I mean, that just all the commitment means you're a placeholder, and now, you've got the first round lead. You got the first round lead at the Masters. You haven't even we haven't even made the cut yet. Type of thing, and that's what's happening. I think there is a lot of that is they got a lot of these big time national kids so early, and other schools are like, well, we're not going to stop recruiting them. Why on earth would anyone stop recruiting Jaden Hazelwood? Especially if he's going to take your call and visit your school.
I was having a conversation with a friend, and he's like, "Well, it's the upside is like it's good for coaches to get a 4-star or 5-star commitment early." And I'm like, "Why? Like they don't care. I mean, that doesn't help them. They have to hold their breath then for the next 9 months. Sometimes it's better just to be in a decent position and just wait and bide your time and try to get the close late in the process, as opposed to just getting an early commitment and then holding your breath for the next 9 months."
The headache. I mean, the headache, I keep thinking about this. This is why I'm ultimately glad that I don't have to, none of this is really ultimately my concern, because it's not my job to recruit kids to a school or anything like that, because all I can think about is the headaches that Ohio State had to go through for 12 months. They put themselves through hell over Jaden Woodby, and then they didn't even sign him. I mean, talking a kid off the ledge every 2 weeks for a year had to be exhausting, and then you didn't even sign him.
Oh, look at the drama that was a certain quarterback that wound up at Florida. I mean, look at same situation.
And Emory, that was even crazier because Emory was solid for a year, and then all of a sudden, it went nuts the last couple months. And Brenton Cox was the same way. Brenton Cox, for 6 months, everyone kept waiting for him to waiver, and for 6 months wasn't visiting anywhere, wasn't really talking to anybody else. Seemed like, oh, well, they've got this one, and then all of a sudden he's gone. I mean, it's probably less energy than they had to spend on Emory or Jaden, but I mean, from the minute Jaden committed, every couple of weeks they were going to have to talk him down. Don't decommit. Don't visit Oklahoma. Don't go to USC. Think about having to do that every couple of weeks for a year. Think about having to do that. How exhausting that must be, and then you don't sign him. So
tongue in cheek, jokingly, they held those
the way
schools.
Nick Saban has done it a lot, which is get about 10 guys early and then get your last 15 guys the last 8 weeks of the cycle.
Yeah, tongue-in-cheek, I jokingly say, well, they did hold off Oklahoma and USC for Woodbay, so...
Right, then he went to Florida State for 2 days, a place he had never been in his life, and decided to throw a year-long... I mean, it would make me pull my hair out. I mean, if I had to worry about that stuff. Well, I mean, luckily I only have to cover it. I don't have any skin in the game, because that had to be something. But quickly back to Georgia. I keep hearing, and I'm skeptical to believe it. Like I said, I will preface this by saying, if you're asking me right now, I still have Nolan Smith signing with Georgia when the time comes. But I do continue to have a few people telling me, look, all these decommitments and all this stuff going on right now, it is affecting him. And it is turning into a thing where he was probably always going to take his visits no matter what. But now there might be a little bit more of a purpose in those visits, as opposed to taking 5 or 4 or 5, however many. I'm assuming he's going to make an official to Georgia, but taking 4 free vacations somewhere has turned into, well, let's take 4 trips and let's take a hard look at those 4 schools. So it's getting if it's been a 1 out of 10 the whole way in terms of intrigue, let's make it a 3 right now. And it's getting a little more interesting to now. I think he's actually going to have a little more purpose on these visits, but we'll see. I'm expecting him at the Michigan game still for Ohio State. We'll see if that comes together.
And Mark, I think that makes Noah Cain's mindset even more important, because if Nolan Smith is waffling even just a little bit, if he ends up at that game with Noah Cain, if Noah Cain starts pushing for it and Noah Cain starts rallying behind the idea of going to Ohio State, maybe that can help a little bit influence Nolan Smith as well.
anything that can improve the mood or the environment or whatever it might be, positive vibes, whatever it might be, whatever you want to call it. I mean, anything like that can help. I mean, certainly, yeah. And if things are moving the right way with Noah, I mean, that's going to be interesting. I'm still kind of see it to believe it with Nolan, not just in terms of Ohio State, in terms of really any school other than Georgia, but there's a little more legs to it. Over the summer, it was a lot of chuckling and you're gonna take his free trips and drive Georgia fans crazy. And now it's like, well, a lot of these decommitments, they are starting to mess with him a little bit in terms of just where his head's at. So we'll see where things go. And he's got to get here, and it's one thing to talk about visiting. It's another, like I said, nothing. We could say, Noah Cain's official now. No, Noah Cain's official when his plane lands. So, once the plane lands, we'll move it up from a 3 to a 5 or something like that. But it's definitely getting a little bit more interesting than maybe I would have expected.
Mark Gibler, catch him on Twitter at MarkGiblerBG. Appreciate it, Mark. We will catch up with you here in a couple weeks.
All right, thank you.
As we wrap it up now for the Unscripted Ohio podcast today, reminder on Friday, Sean Callahan, publisher of Husker Online, will be here. We will preview Ohio State, Nebraska, and hope to get into a little bit of national college football talk as well. I didn't mention the college football playoff first rankings coming out, but that will be out tomorrow. And I will get into that a little bit, kind of go over the surprises and what to make of those first rankings. So we will talk some college football on Friday. And remember, Ohio State basketball tips off in 10 days, less than 10 days, probably by the time you're listening to this. But November 7th, that is next Wednesday night, Ohio State will meet Cincinnati in that much-anticipated season opening game for both teams. And that will be the reopening of a renovated Fifth Third Arena. So very excited. We will talk some basketball a little bit, probably on Friday, as well as I'll sprinkle in some on Monday, the Monday show as well, leading up to the Wednesday tip-off. So Buckeye basketball right around the corner, and we will talk about that. Anyhow, be back on Friday. We'll talk some football, especially, and a little bit of basketball mixed in. Hope you join me then, everybody. Until then, have a great week. Go Bucks.
You can get new episodes of Unscripted Ohio on Mondays and Fridays exclusively at BuckeyeGrove.com or anytime on SoundCloud, iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher. Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all things Ohio State.